when I left Fashion Group, I've been there for.
All right,
Staff engineer,
Yeah.
like I never needed to go get anybody.
I'm on it, wait,
or anything.
you need to
Yeah,
share.
If I did need something procedural.
Oh, yeah, once he does that, I'll share my presentation.
Yeah, you did get the link okay.
Yeah, I think I'm on
Is
Zoom
it?
and everything, so.
So you were still at.
Perfect.
Oh,
Right?
Is
Yeah,
it ready?
You're
yeah,
gonna do our talk.
yeah, I think we're ready to get going. Hi, everybody, especially those online. Thank you for joining. We're very glad that Chad from Cynerio is here. I want to briefly, really quickly, just make a couple of statements about the chapter and what to expect next year. This will be our last event this year. I do have a couple of vendors I'm talking to about sponsoring some events for us early next year. But that doesn't mean we want everything to be just vendors. If you can host us, we would graciously take some space. If you would like to speak, even if you happen to be a college student, I think there might be some on the call, or you're the most seasoned employee ever. Any talks are welcome. This should be more about our community than the vendors that we have had come talk with us. But we do appreciate their sponsorship as well. So all talks are welcome. If you have an idea, something that you've been researching, for example, I've done some bug bounty things that I could potentially talk about. If you poke and just are a security nerd, you have a quick talk. It doesn't have to be a long one. We'd love to have you speak. This would be a good practice, friendly audience, I'm sure. And if we host it here or we do it virtually, all options are welcome. So please do let us know. You can reach out to me or Linda or Brandon. All of us are here today, so we can all actually wave at you for once. We appreciate all of those attendees.
And I was gonna add one thing too, even if you don't wanna talk, but maybe there's topics you're interested in, let us know, because we have a wide community as well that we could potentially bring somebody in.
Absolutely.
So this is your meeting, we're trying to get the topics that you guys wanna hear about, so just let us know.
Yep. And so the PowerPoint that has been on, nice transition, just a lot slower than I had intended. I don't PowerPoint with the best of them. I will send these out as mostly just to help share some links to things that people may not be aware of. And if you share them with your friends, that's very much appreciated. They are links to paper call where we would take call for papers if you want to talk here. YouTube to find videos from sessions just like this one. So the recording for this will totally end up on that same YouTube channel. And a LinkedIn group and our Slack channel. It would be nice to actually have an active Slack channel in the OWASP Slack. So you don't have to be an OWASP member, just register for that account and we can keep up more regularly outside of the more cumbersome platforms that we have available to us today, like Meetup. So pretty much anything but Meetup if you ask me, but it's a kind of required use case for RSVPs, just so OWASP has some visibility here. Otherwise, join those the QR codes that'll be in those slides you can use to find those links. Otherwise, I will share links directly to you. And lastly, January 22nd will be our next meetup event. That's a secure coding tournament that we'll do. So it'll be a lot like the Capture the Flag event we had, because this time we'll write code to do those things. Security Journey will be joining us for that one. I'm pretty excited. And we're looking forward to it. So hope everybody has a good holiday season. And we'll look forward to seeing those of you who aren't here with us today, maybe next time in January. With that, I'm going to let Chad introduce himself and excited for your talk.
Cool.
Thank you,
Let me
sir.
share my screen. Can you let me share?
Yes,
Oh, yeah, you
Yes.
grant match.
And as we do that, I do highly recommend, even if you're terrified of speaking, OWASP chapters I've presented at dozens and a bunch of other places. These are some of the more welcoming crowds I've seen. So even if it's just a 10 or 15-minute talk about something cool, they're incredibly well received. No one in the audience here is going to boo me or anyone else, so highly recommend it. When I was in college, I would actually either do my presentations before class or I would be on team projects where other people presented because I was so terrified of speaking. This is a good way to get over that because they're great crowds. So with that, you guys should not boo me today because you proved me wrong. All right. So what we're going to talk about today is patients at risk in the healthcare cybersecurity crisis we're facing. I have a flair for the dramatic. I'm going to try to convince you that I'm not being dramatic with this title today, and you all can judge me on whether or not I am. So a little bit about me, first of all, if I look vaguely familiar, this is at least my third live presentation, and I've done a bunch online for this particular chapter. I used to run cyber range events with a company called Security Innovation, so there's a vague familiarity, that's probably why. Right now, my role is called Security Evangelist. I was talking to the crowd earlier. I highly recommend failing your way upwards into that position if you can. I have a background in software development and pen testing and working with a lot of startups to get them off the ground and going to market. And now I take all of that effort and present on it, mostly to healthcare companies at this point for Scenario, the company I work for more for now. My goals today are a couple things. One is I'm going to try to define the healthcare cybersecurity challenge. Because if I came here and said, hey, we have the best product in the world, just buy us and everything will be great, you'd all roll your eyes, walk out and want to learn anything. So I want to first say, hey, here are the challenges we're facing, define the problem. Then we'll take a little bit of a look at the root causes and the risks. And then finally look at new guidance and innovations that are helping to protect against them. And that's where I will do a very light plug about the company, and I'll try not to be too vendory other than that. If you do have questions, type them in, ask them, raise your hand. Be as interactive as you want. I'm guessing this talk takes about 45 minutes. We'll go shorter or longer, depending on you guys. So, little bit of an overview today. First, we're going to talk about, is there actually a problem? If there is not, we'll be out of here in 5 minutes, so there has to be. We'll then talk about the impacts of the problems of cybersecurity, how it's impacting patients, facilities, and most importantly, and I shouldn't say this, but finances. People die, that's bad. If we lose money, that actually makes people do more. The root causes of these challenges, and then the evolving guidance, as well as a discussion on regulation or non-regulation. And of course, as we go through, feel free to ask questions. So first thing today, is there a problem? We're going to do a little bit of a guessing game. We've got some stats for you guys, and either online or in the room. First of all, what happens every 7.1 minutes in terms of healthcare? Anyone?
I mean, you already filled it in.
Have I?
Cyberattacks.
There's a cyber attack every 7.1 minutes on a US hospital. Is it a higher or lower rate globally? More or less frequent globally?
Less.
More. It's actually slightly more frequent. It's every 6.8 minutes. So roughly in the time we're here tonight, we'll have 10 cyber attacks on healthcare systems in the US. Doesn't mean they're successful, doesn't mean that they all go through, but that's the frequency of major attacks that we're seeing. 24%. 24% of what in healthcare? Or more importantly, in critical infrastructure. 24% of attacks on critical infrastructure are healthcare environments. And as you'll see today, it's because we are the easiest environment to attack and we are the most profitable to attack. 67% of hospitals have been hit by a ransomware attack in 2024. Again, doesn't mean it was successful, but have been hit by one. That's a lot. There's 6,000 to 7,000 hospitals in the US. It means thousands of hospitals are being hit each year. 1 in 3 patient records have been exposed in 2024. The Change Healthcare attack, the payment processor, as we'll see in a little bit, surpassed that number by itself with its attack earlier this year. But 1 in 3 people in the US had their patient records exposed last year, including me from Anna Jake's Hospital in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And that's the only thing that we're going to talk about tonight that's actually regulated. Everything else is done as a best practice or a hope. That's the only thing that people have to meet for regulations right now. And then finally, 53% of ransom data is returned when that data is stolen. So there's this kind of honor amongst these, or used to be, that if you get attacked, they steal your data, and I'll talk about triple extortion as we go through. If you pay them off, there's this thought that, hey, they're going to return the data and everything's going to be fine. About half the time, that's the case. And yet people are still paying off about 45, 50% of the time. So we're seeing this really weird environment where there's a lot of attacks, there's damages there, and still the attackers are having their way. And why this is all happening is really, really easy. It's completely about money, right? We can say that they're evil, we can say that they're bad nation states, At the end of the day, the reason that healthcare environments are getting attacked is purely dollars and cents, 99 point whatever 9% of the time.
So,
Yeah,
oh, sorry,
no,
I
good.
was gonna say, like, sorry, on your, you might have had this. So it's more ransomware versus actually stealing the data?
Okay, so yeah, so let's talk about triple extortion a little bit. So there's this really cool attack pattern. And I say cool because it's evil, but it is really genius, right? So I don't want to say you should do this, but I'm saying this is what's happening because evil geniuses are doing it. They go in, they do recon on your network, right? And they find a bunch of different ways they can get in. And then it's almost like the Russia versus China mindset to attacking. And I say this because this is how the two nation states are attacking us. Russia goes in and they want to attack you immediately, right? They want to execute as quickly as possible. China goes in and they'll sit there forever on critical infrastructure. And so what happens more in the Russian mindset there is they'll go in, they'll find a bunch of ways to attack you. When they're ready to pull the trigger, they'll they'll steal the data first, then they'll encrypt the data. And then they'll say, if you pay our ransom, we'll give you the data back, we'll unencrypt everything. In theory, you'll be up in a couple of hours. So first extortion is stealing the data, we're gonna release it if you don't. Second extortion is pay us the ransom, or we're not gonna restore your system. Third is they then go into the data and they find politicians, famous people, actors, rich people. And they go to those individuals and say, we have your records as well. And if you pay us $30,000, $10,000, whatever, we're not going to release your individual records. And so what it comes down to is the hospital has been fully attacked. The hospital cannot provide care because the systems are encrypted, they're down. And the data is out there for certain people as well as the general population. And so it really is this brilliant, evil brilliance of how can they drive revenue. And it all comes back to the dollars and cents. So if we look at the record value for things that you can steal, a social security number, they're so easy to get right now. We should all just assume our social security numbers are out there, easy to get. They only get about $1 on the dark web right now. It's really not that valuable. Credit card information is somewhere between $3 and $5 because if we lose our credit cards, we cancel it. And there's that small window where you can actually go and charge money on that credit card. A patient record, EPHI, is roughly between $50 and $250 per record. And it's because our data cannot be changed, right? If you look at our patient data, it's not only what treatments have I had, I had a x-ray on my knee a couple of years ago. They can see that, but it's also what else I've had, where I've lived, what my parents and family names are, all this data that's incredibly valuable for committing fraud. So it's not about embarrassing me with my patient records. It's about I have all the data needed to steal my identity and benefit from that. Now, funny enough, this record value is going down. It used to be as high as $500. It's closer to the $25 to $50 right now because there are so many patient records out there that there's an economy of scale that's working, where the value is going down because they're easier and easier to get, which means we're doing a worse and worse job.
So we should just release all the records and then it will be back.
Do you want all your medical records out there?
Wouldn't be surprised.
A lot of them probably are, yeah.
Maybe a good time for a PSA that if you haven't frozen your credit, you should probably do that today.
Yeah. Not only freeze your credit, but have your credit monitored as well.
I maintained free credit monitoring for years because
Because
they keep giving me free credit.
Exactly.
I still have a Sony PlayStation account, so that just gives me free credit monitoring every year. If we look at ransom payments in the US last year, they were about $100 million, where hospitals specifically went and paid the ransom with some degree of success, again, about half the time.
And those are just the ones reported.
There you
Because
go.
There is a ton of them that pay, but don't report.
And we'll get into that a little bit. You've got to remember, the only thing that's regulated in healthcare in terms of cybersecurity right now is if you have a data breach of more than 500 records, you must report that so they can notify people. And I think it's like 48 hours, some reasonable time frame, depending who you ask. If it's less than 500, you have to report by the end of the year. That's the only thing that's regulated because when they created those laws almost 20 years ago, when they were digitizing records, that's the worst thing anyone can think of is, oh no, these records are now going to be digital. Someone might steal them. There was never a thought of a hospital being fully attacked, devices going down, hospitals closing their doors because they were hit by an attack. So that's why we're seeing these money. So Change, a local company, payment processing, they got hit by an attack, and we'll talk about this a little more as we go as well. They got hit by an attack earlier this year that had an overall impact of over $2 billion with a B dollars, because about a third of America process medical payments using Change Health. And these are small doctor's offices, hospitals, everything in between. They paid the $22 million hoping that it would restore them overnight. Did it? No. And the only reason that we know about this is because these hacker gangs are actually run like companies, right? They often have HR, they have people that will specifically negotiate ransom payments, all that stuff. And in this case, there was one hacker gang that actually did the attack, and there was one that was actually trying to do the negotiation. They were working together. The ransom got paid. Did they split that money? No, they did not. So one hacker group got mad at the other hacker group, reported them, and then it got even messier than it already was. So again, no honor amongst thieves there. But at the end of the day, we're seeing massive, massive amounts of money paid, and that's why we continue to get attacked. About half, as you were saying earlier, pay the ransom. It's probably a higher rate than that, but because you don't have to report that, we have no way of knowing this. The FBI put out a stat that about 250 hospitals paid the ransom last year. I think it's much higher than that. And then there was the triple extortion we were talking about earlier, which is attackers find a path to revenue no matter what. And in fact, they have such a backlog of places that they've already compromised, and they're sitting in the environments that they're picking and choosing who they go after and when. It's not a matter of them finding a vulnerability and exploiting that. It's them picking and choosing who they're going to negotiate with next. It's absolutely terrifying. And these attacks are all over the place. This is kind of what we've seen in our customers' environments. And by the way, we focus on IoT and IoMT, so everything that's non-IT in an environment. We've seen stress test treadmills, right? You get on, you walk uphill, and you have everything strapped to you. We've seen that hit by WannaCry, and I'll talk about the history of WannaCry in a little bit, where the stress test treadmill was infected and started trying to communicate with every single device on the network. That's not good. But because healthcare environments have flat networks, because there are very few protections in place once you get past the perimeter, those attacks spread like wildfire. The microbial detection unit that was infected by Crackbot is my favorite. Effectively, this was trying to connect to Syria. It had no interface. It had no screen other than the touch buttons. But it got infected. We weren't sure how. We just knew that it was. And again, it was trying to replicate throughout the environment. That's my favorite because the fix for this was really, really fun. It was past its sunset date. They were going to replace it anyway. So they literally took it out of the parking lot and smashed it with a hammer. So it couldn't be resold, infected on the black market. A real office space situation. Now, for something small, you can do that. A CT machine, you can't do that with. But something that's a couple $1,000s that was being replaced anyway, you could. We also see things like remote access Trojans that are screen capturing financial data and patient data and stealing it that way. So if you look at network traffic, you're just seeing screenshots of financial data going across. That's a bad thing. And then finally, we've even seen things where a vendor laptop got on, bypassed onboarding procedures because the onboarding procedures for a new employee was different than the vendor. They had a crypto miner on there. This was a greenfield situation. The hospital hadn't opened yet. They go in, the vendor plugs in this perfectly pristine environment is infected with crypto miners before they even open their doors. And so we're seeing all of these attacks coming through. It only takes one weakness to get in, and then they're replicating throughout environments incredibly rapidly because there are almost no protections in place. There is no segmentation. At best, you might have some VLANs set up. And that's where we start to see things get really, really messy because you find that one hole in the system and then everything gets compromised pretty quickly. So the question, is there a problem? Does anyone disagree? Anyone think that no, there is not a problem? Good answer. Thank you for not challenging me there. So let's actually take a little bit of a look at the impact of these attacks. Because at the end of the day, we talked about it earlier, money is the thing that makes people change their behavior, right? From the executives down. But this is having a much bigger impact than just the financial impact on the hospitals. It is having a real impact on patients, but not the way that our lizard brains typically think. So again, to dive a little deeper into Change Healthcare, they paid the ransom. They saw the cost per day cascading down to their customers at over $100 million. It was just an absolute nightmare. People could not pay their bills. And when you have a doctor's office that's only 2 or 3 people, you might go out of business and you can't pay your bills for a couple of weeks. And people were literally going out of business or getting close to it. Change actually found money to extend the lines of credit. It got really, really complex and nasty, but we made it through. At the end of the day, the initial cost that they reported started at 900 million. By the end of the quarter, it went up to like 1.8 or 1.9 billion, and it has far surpassed $2 billion in real costs. This is downtime, this is recovery, this is patient monitoring, it's all those nasty things that come out of it. This is one attack that happened. And as I said before, this exposed 1/3 of the patients in the US, which is equivalent to all records exposed across about 750 attacks from last year. So this year, we're probably going to see 400 million records exposed, which is great because there's only 350 million people in the US. So we're talking about people that are deceased. We're talking about people's records being exposed multiple times over, things like that. But it's not just Change Healthcare either, right? There are, does anyone know what the wall of shame is? The HHS wall of shame. Right. So Health and Human Services, I mentioned earlier, you have to report if you've been breached. So what they do with that data breach information is they immediately go and post it on the website that anyone can go and look at, which is a treasure trove for hackers that want to see what hospitals have been hacked and may be vulnerable to more attacks. So you can go there and actually look at every hospital, every ambulance service, every doctor's office that's been attacked, the number of records exposed, a high level category of how they were attacked. Was it IT? Was it someone walked out with papers, et cetera? And the number of records exposed. So that's the information we know is available. But we've had a handful of hospitals that have actually come out and said, not only were we hacked, here's why we were hacked and here's how much it cost us. Because in some cases they had to because their financial reporting structure, like Scripps. In other cases like University of Vermont, they just looked at what was going on and said, we can do this as a public good. We can either hide this and say, hey, we screwed up, or we can say someone went on vacation, they took their laptop with them, like we all do. They were literally poolside, opened it up, clicked on the wrong email on Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. And a day later, our whole hospital system was encrypted for the next 6 weeks. And that's what happened with the University of Vermont. The public costs there were about 63 million. This is mostly in lost revenue and recovery costs. In reality, it's over 100 million at this point. That's just what the last number they gave. It's really frustrating for them in particular because they were doing tours. They were doing American Health Association podcasts, trying to say, please listen to us, learn from our experience, and it mostly fell on deaf ears. Next, we have Point32 Health. They got hit by a cyber attack. They're more on the payer side, so the insurance side. They got hit for $102 million. Scripps is interesting. It's in Southern California. They have, I think it's 5 hospitals and 19 clinics around the area. They got hit by an attack that took them out for between 5 and 6 weeks. They were one of the first to actually publish the numbers with a breakdown, right? So it cost them about $22 million to recover. It cost them another, 50 or 60 in deferred costs, right? They have a lot of elective surgeries, a lot of things where they make revenue to offset other costs. They lost money there. Scripps had cybersecurity insurance. They were fully insured. How much do you think that paid?
10%.
10% would be 11 million. You're optimistic. It's about 5.8 to 6 million, somewhere in there. The other thing that came out of this and a few other things is people actually started reading their cybersecurity insurance riders. And a lot of them say, if we pay you out, we have the ability to take over all of your IT operations until we guarantee they're secured. Do hospitals want an outside insurance company coming in and looking at their IT infrastructure? For the most part, they don't, right? And no one really would because they're going to start locking down things that may impact patient care. As we get further down the list, Ireland's public healthcare system, HSE, Health Services Executive. They had 80% of their IT systems encrypted for 5 months. It cost them over $500 million to recover. And then they went and got hit by another cyber attack just a few months ago.
How did they work for 5 months?
Oh, okay. So during a cyber attack, who's the most valuable person in that healthcare community? Any guesses? Recently retired nurses. You take someone that learned how to provide care in 1970, 1980. there were no computers. Everything was pen, paper, booklets. There's this booklet that doctors used to carry around. They had a specific sleeve in their gown things. And it was this long sleeve because they would have this long book and it was all the anesthesiology measurements and calculations and everything, so they could look them up right there. There was this fascinating event I went to in DC where they simulated a cyber attack and the 30-year-old doctor was panicking and the 70-year-old doctor was like, nah, I got this, I'm riding my elephant. So at the end of the day, they had a bunch of nurses that they could bring in and doctors they could bring in that could provide care without technology.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because it's not the only industry that I've heard, where older technologies, the non-digital aspects, anything that could go analog could and should. Have you seen that incidents like this produce something like a game day exercise where hospitals or healthcare practices now consider the option that, maybe you will be attacked and it might be successful. So what do we do and can we prepare for it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's an organization, it's a federal organization called CISA, right? And they actually offer free tabletop exercises to anyone in the healthcare space. Intermountain Health is kind of seen as the gold standard right now. They have a CISO named Eric Decker who is like just making mountains move over there to put security practices in place. Their team does 5 tabletop exercises a year. Most people do between 0 and 1. So it's not that the tabletop exercises aren't available, it's that people just don't have the team, the time, the expertise to do them.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
The worst case out of all this is St. Margaret's. This is in, I believe it's Indiana or Illinois. I keep getting it mixed up. St. Margaret's was a small rural hospital, no other hospitals within about 45 miles of it. They were already having financial difficulties. They got hit by a ransomware attack and they were out for about a month. It wasn't the ransomware attack that made them close their doors. It was the financial implications, because they could provide care, but they couldn't bill Medicare and Medicaid to pay for that care. They actually had to go bankrupt. And now we have this community that's on its own little island. You have to drive an hour in any direction to get care now. And that's what's really going to threaten our healthcare system, is if we see more and more closures like that. And the way these attacks happen are pretty simple. And again, this is something I stole directly from Eric Decker from Intermountain. We want to say they're big, complex attacks. They're not. They're social engineering, right? They're calling the help desk and getting someone's password reset. They're third-party compromise, such as Change Healthcare, or their system vulnerability compromise. Effectively, there are thousands and thousands of known vulnerabilities in every environment, and they're just hitting things that are known. These are not hard attacks. It's just a matter of finding the vulnerability and then executing. They have all kinds of references if anyone needs them. And if we look at the history of these, we can see this is something, oops, there we go, that has grown over time. So the first actual known ransomware attack was like late 80s, early 90s on a healthcare system. It was more of someone just messing around than anything else. But that was the very first recorded ransomware attack. They didn't actually become a moneymaker or widely known until 2017, when something called WannaCry hit the entire world. But the organization that hit the hardest was NHS, which is the UK's public health system. And at the time, it cost NHS about $100 million, 92 million pounds to recover from that. And that was an astronomical sum at the time, right? 92 million pounds to recover from a ransomware attack, to get a whole health system online. No one had ever seen anything like that, experienced it. They didn't know where to go from there. As I mentioned, there was a couple years off, but as COVID started to ramp up, attackers realized hospitals are just trying to help people survive, right? We're in a bad spot. They're probably going to pay if it means they can get back online. And so in 2021, that's where the attacks really started happening. We saw HSE, we saw 200 events in Europe, we saw thousands of events in the US at that time. We also saw that data start to be stolen at a massive rate in terms of millions and millions of patients here. And I talk about Change Healthcare here in the States. Synovis was a blood testing company in June 2024 that got hit equally as hard. They demanded a $50 million ransom. Now, I will say European countries tend to pay the ransoms less than we see in the US. They did not acknowledge whether or not they paid that ransom. So I'm going to err on the side of, yeah, they probably did if they didn't come out and say we're not paying. But that one canceled 6,000 appointments over the case of a couple of days. And so we're starting to see there's a real impact here, not just in terms of finances, but in terms of people. And so I did this fun exercise today that took me about 3 minutes. It took me about 5 minutes, but the hotel internet was slow. And I said, what's happened in Tennessee in terms of cyber attacks recently? And luckily, or unluckily, we have a few. Ascension got hit earlier this year, where they saw an 8 to 12% drop in facility volume. So that's not only patients that can't be cared for, but we know that when you see that drop, there's a ripple effect to other hospitals. Much like if there's a mass emergency, there's this ripple effect that compromises care. It also hurts their revenue by 8 to 12%. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Tennessee has been hit twice in the last 15 years. That should say 2023 movement, not 2003, sorry. But earlier this year, the big movement vulnerability that hit a bunch of places, this is a secure file transfer that was anything but secure, that exposed 1,600 records. Back in 2009, they actually had 57 hard drives physically stolen from their server racks, which exposed 500,000 records. So we can see most of this is digital theft, but at that point it was physical. And then MMC was Murfreesboro.
Murfreesboro.
There we go, thank you. A New England accent does not work without that in it. But that was an attack in April 2023 where they took the network offline. Over 500,000 people were exposed. Now, funny enough, I was walking over here and I looked up and I saw HCA. HCA also got hit earlier, I think it was earlier this year as well, exposing millions and millions of records, if I remember right. So you can literally walk through a major city and just look at the healthcare names and say, oh yeah, that probably got hit, that probably got hit. It's not uncommon. And if we look at the broader ransomware attack snapshot, sorry for the small numbers, but effectively in 2023, we saw 725 HIPAA data breaches. That has doubled since 2018. The numbers just keep climbing through the roof. The thing that's interesting is the number of records is outpacing the number of attacks. So the attackers are getting really, really efficient at going after big hospitals that have more money and have more records to steal. We also know that the average ransom is 4.4 million, but what attackers are really, really smart about is they go in and they realize, depending on the size of the hospital, there is a certain threshold that executives can spend without having to report publicly or reporting to the board. So a small hospital might only be able to pay 250 grand. A big one might be able to spend 5-10 million. And so they actually tailor their ransom demands to whatever is going to expedite the payment in a bunch of different ways. And the impacts across the board impact devices, payment systems, anything that's out there. The bigger challenge here is that when you look at how patients are impacted, it's not what our lizard brains immediately go to, right? Because in my world, where I'm the most important person ever, I think, okay, an attacker's gonna come in, they're gonna break in, and they're gonna overdose my IV pump, and they're gonna kill me that way. The reality is there's only like 25 people in the whole world that are worthy of that kind of attention. They're not getting care in hospitals that have publicly accessible IV pumps, right? When the president goes in, I think it's Walter Reed, his stuff is not online, right? It's a completely different network. What's actually happening though, is we have to start thinking about healthcare in terms of how we think about other natural disasters. We have to group it in with hurricanes and blizzards and earthquakes, because the impact is not that we've been hit by a cyber attack. The impact is that our systems are down. And where our systems go down for whatever reason, we know that we have that ripple effect outwards. We know that we also have lower levels of care. And so, for example, this is a survey we did with an organization called the Ponymon Institute in 2022. Ponymon does things like the IBM data breach report, do a bunch of those surveys. So I begged my boss, can we please do something with them? She found money for that. I was super happy about that. But what we did was we went in and specifically started looking at non-IT devices in networks and the impact of attacks on those devices. We'll talk about what those devices are, but at the end of the day, we asked, how do criminals disrupt patient care? And the number one thing, about half the time when these people surveyed had experienced attack, and again, this is just healthcare environments, half of them said we were not able to provide care. Not that we weren't able to provide care at a level that we expected, we just weren't able to provide care at all. And if you go down from there, we saw that patient records were stolen a little under half the time. Occasionally, an attacker took control of the device. But at the end of the day, they're delaying care from patients to get their money. And if we look at what the impact of that delayed care is, we start to see things that kind of fall into collateral damage. It's not the immediate overdose of the person, it's that ripple effect. Longer length of stays. We all know the longer you're in the hospital, the more dangerous it becomes to you. We saw increases in mortality rates 53% of the time. Now, I want to be clear, it doesn't mean that there's 50% more mortality rates. It means that half the time mortality rates went up. I'm really, really proud of that number because as we've seen more and more studies come out, the calculated percent of that actually goes down to about 25%. So half the time you get hit by a ransomware attack, half the time the mortality rates go up. So the math there is 25%. We nailed that as well, along with 4 or 5 other studies that have come up, including one that focused on Medicare and Medicaid and the impact to specific cohorts, specifically seniors. They found that the mortality rates raised about 30% there. So we were within a degree of error. But then you see there's things like poor outcomes, complications for medical procedures, et cetera. So it's not because, again, that I'm being attacked. It's because we're all in a hospital where they can't provide care, and therefore we're having compromised care from it. Does that make sense? It's an important distinction, but it's one that's really important to talk about. The reason I spent a little bit of time on this is I've been on far too many calls with C-levels that say, give me one name of a person that's died from a cyber attack. And that's a really frustrating question because first of all, if your hospital has someone that dies from a cyber attack, are you going to put that name out there? Absolutely not, because it's a huge liability. You're saying, hey, come sue us. Second of all, it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the issue. There's the thought that people are being killed by hackers, when in fact they're just taking out systems and people are being killed by collateral damage. There is one known and one falsely known issue there. One is there was a child that was born during an attack, I believe it was Mississippi. The child had compromised care and unfortunately passed away about a month later. And that's an ongoing lawsuit, but it is believed that that attack compromised the care. There was another one in Germany where a woman got hit by, was in a hospital that was hit by a cyber attack, was transferred and died during transfer. The reality of that one is she probably would have passed away anyway, but it got headlines because there was a cyber attack involved. So it's really important to understand not only the situation, but how to educate people on what's really happening there. Any questions about the impact of attacks on patients in particular?
Not like life support machines and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, so that would fall under IoT and IoMT devices. I'll give you 1 or 2 slides and I'll get there. Okay.
This is a maybe touchy subject, but I'll ask anyway. The election's over, so it's perfect timing for that. Do you think
I'm a New Englander in the South. Let's go for it.
All right. Do you think that the countries that have universal healthcare or government single payer are more vulnerable to these kinds of attacks or less than versus our extremely fragmented, complicated hellscape system that we have here in the US?
Neither, and it's a good question. We have to look at it in terms of what they're deploying in their hospitals. So whether it's us or European countries, and I'm going to include the UK there, we tend to have more advanced healthcare systems as well as some Southeastern Asian countries. And therefore we've said, oh my goodness, if we put every IV pump online and connect it to the nurse's station, and I can tell the person's pulse rate and their oxygen rate and all that stuff immediately, I can provide a better level of care, which you absolutely can. But you also open up the threat landscape dramatically. So it's not about public versus private in that case. It's about who has money to spend on advanced care and who doesn't.
I meant more so for like the payment processors and like you mentioned billing Medicare and Medicaid.
Yep.
Does that become simpler when instead of having the NHS, we have Cigna, Aetna, Anthem, Blue
Yep.
Cross Blue Shield, all of that?
You still have third parties no matter what, right? So whether it's a payment processor or a blood testing like Synovus that I mentioned earlier, you're still going to have third parties that are in there exposing you. So in the US where we have those payment processors and insurers, that's just another third party we have to deal with. The UK, the money stuff is in other socialized medicine. The money stuff is a little bit different, but they still are finding money and processing it with the government, but there are other third parties that they're relying on.
Got it. That makes perfect sense.
It's more that we see slightly lower rates of ransom payment because in the UK, for example, and I'll get into regulation a little bit, but in the UK, they've bought in more to you never pay the ransom because it will encourage more attacks. And so they've actually seen a lower rate of attacks in the EU and UK totally than we have, because we have 7,000 or 6,000 hospitals making individual decisions, whereas they have one major health system. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, cool.
If I can add to that, 'cause that was a good question. Is the idea of maybe like the single payer systems, the flavors that you'll have out there, does that also maybe increase the blast radius of what could happen should the ransomware attack be successful?
Oh, interesting. So it all comes down to interconnected systems, right? So it's more likely, Common Spirit was one that I showed there earlier. I didn't talk about them. Common Spirit was about 2 years ago, they got hit by a cyber attack, and they actually had a really good security practice at their core, but then they went and acquired like 3 or 4 dozen other hospitals and did not do a full security audit. So when they acquired that, they acquired all their risk, and they got hit by about $160 million there. So it's more about what's connected within that healthcare system. So again, I'll get to regulations here. What we're seeing, I'll pick on Europe here a little bit, because Europe is effectively, 30 different countries where they all have socialized healthcare for the most part. It's more likely that you're going to see a IoMT situation where the whole system goes down because everything's interconnected. But again, it depends on how the systems are laid out. Good questions. So let's talk a little bit about root causes. Are we good for time? Going a little long? Yeah, cool. All right, well, that's good. So my thesis, and I'm going to try to convince you of this, is that security adoption in healthcare is about 15 to 20 years behind. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. One is IoT and IoMT devices. And again, this is where our company focuses. But if you look at a typical healthcare environment, about half of it is IT, meaning laptops, printers, servers, things like that. But the other half is IoT or IoMT. This is anything from an IV pump to a door lock system to a security camera to robots that I'll talk about. And you'll see a little lower down the slide that the spend and effort to secure IT is hugely skewed in that direction, right? So because if you think about a healthcare environment, most people are not top level security engineers, not to knock them down at all. But if you're in a healthcare environment and Google comes knocking and says, I'll pay you 400 grand a year to be a security engineer, you're taking that job, right? So we're not always seeing the biggest budgets. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you finish the thought.
No, we're not seeing the biggest budgets. We don't see the most training. We don't see the top-notch security in healthcare. If for no other reason, because healthcare is there to provide care, not to be security experts. Yeah, go for it.
So how much of this do you think with the Internet of Things kind of oversight is on security for the hospital, the healthcare environment versus unsecure design of IoT? Like every time I hear about IoT, I hear about like, I've got my IoT toaster, refrigerator, or router, and the firmware never gets updated under any cases. So we talk about like a security camera that they put in the hospital. Yeah, I'm sure some of it's network segmentation and design in that regard, but how much of it's just that the person who makes the insulin pump that is IoT for some reason doesn't keep up with maintaining security on the device?
So we did another really fun study where effectively my engineers gave me all the data we had and said, just slice and dice it how you want. So I went in there. This is where I actually have some skill sets, so I can still write SQL queries. 53% of the devices we see have a known critical vulnerability that is unpatched. And again, as others have published their numbers, it's somewhere between 45 and 70%. It's somewhere in there. If you go and look at the operating systems they're running, very few of them have a standard operating system. They're typically some kind of trimmed down mobile operating system or something so completely customized to that device that once it goes past its sunset date, you're just not getting updates. So the short answer to your question is we need to assume that every single IoT or IoMT, Internet of Medical Things device has some kind of vulnerability that can be compromised. We just have to assume that at this point. So that goes back to, is it realistic to think that we can actually patch each of those? And no, we can't, because so many are past their end of life. And therefore we have to start looking at things like network segmentation, like network detection and response to actually see the attacks as they're happening and stop them. It's the academic versus practical. Academically, we want every single manufacturer to keep up with every single device. they're just not gonna do that, and they won't be forced to do that. So we have to figure out practically what we can do.
Thank you.
Yeah,
IoT cameras in particular, nightmarish. I know this because I work with them a lot. The first time I even thought about security in my job as a developer was when I found a 0-day on a camera manufactured by a giant company without even looking for it.
Yeah.
You could change the password of the camera without knowing the current password of the camera.
yeah. And I'll give the story I like telling the best that got us sued, partially sued, in just a minute, along the lines of IoT cameras, but even more fun.
Yeah.
Next, when you look at healthcare environments, when you're overly focused on IT, the old practices are going to be the ones you're implementing. So we talk to a lot of places where they're like, now we've got our firewalls, we've got our routers set up, we have a perimeter, we're good. There is almost no defense in depth, which means once you get in an environment, it's a flat network, you can traverse that network almost as much as you want. And particularly as we've deployed all these IoT devices, the reality is a lot of the times the IoT devices are not what's ultimately leading to the attack. They're not necessarily the ones exposing the data. They're not necessarily the ones that are taken out, but they're the ones that allow traversal, and they're all the ones that allow you to move around that environment. So we know that the old practices are absolutely necessary. Yes, you need to segment your guest network from your internal network, but that's not going to stop all the attacks that are coming in. We also know that we're just not going to patch everything. I mentioned the 53% stat number. Veracode, one of my many former employers, also did a study. They do static binary analysis where they look at the binary and find vulnerabilities. They did a study last year or a year and a half ago, and they said for log4shell, right? So that's a vulnerability that was 2.5 years old now. 38% of the code they looked at still had known log4shell vulnerabilities that weren't patched. And this was across all industries. This wasn't just healthcare. So I can promise you healthcare is much higher. So you would think any place that has good patch management in place would get that, because that was such a massive, impactful, well-known vulnerability, but it's still widespread. So we can't really rely on patching, because even if we patched everything, it only takes one misconfiguration to make something vulnerable. It only takes exposing that one security camera or IV pump or CT machine to the outside world to make it vulnerable. Even if you just had admin as the credentials.
Yep,
They do.
all the time.
Yeah. All the time. Or admin nothing. It's another good one.
Admin 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, admin password.
Do you guys know what MDS2 forms are? So MDS2 forms, it's a long explanation, but effectively it's the default security settings for the devices as you get them. They're not mandated, but they're kind of highly recommended by the industry. So when you get a new device, you get an MDS2 form that says this is how it should be configured and all that stuff. That will tell you things like, does it have a web interface? What are the default credentials? Things like that. They're pretty easy to get. So if you can identify the device, you can get the MDS2. There's the info you need. One thing we've heard up until recently is that hospitals don't have enough guidance on what they should be doing. And we're seeing a shift that I'll talk about in a little bit. They now have really good guidance, and now it's putting that guidance in practice. So this is kind of put your money where your mouth is time for a lot of hospitals. Of IT spend, and so first of all, everyone sees IT spend as a waste in hospitals, right? They don't realize that it's providing better care, that they're billing more, that they're getting people out. They forget all that stuff, and they say, hey, we have to cut down on spend. Of that IT spend though, only 3% is spent on security, which is tiny. And then even smaller percent of that is spent on IoT security. So like 2.9% is spent on IT security and 0.1% on IoT. We all have jobs for as long as we need them for the most part, right? There's a huge IT shortage. Roughly for every security job that exists, there's almost one whole other job that is unfilled right now. There's about 45% of IT jobs in the world are unfilled. And the hospitals, unfortunately, are not top spenders, right? Again, they don't want to be security experts, they want to provide care. So the people that demand top dollar are going to other industries. We also have actuarial realities. And this is one, I was so depressed after this, but it made so much sense. I went to a compliance and risk webinar, actual place in Florida, actual event. And I went up to some of the compliance officers and I said, if I tell you about this whiteboard. So we had a whiteboard, kind of like the TV back there, where you can write on it, and nurses kind of keep track of who's in what room. If I told you that that caches every person that ever went through the system, and that it has a web face that you can get to unauthenticated, what would you tell me? I had 2 people literally turn around and walk away from me. Because if they knew about that and they had that, they would actually have to address it. And this goes to the actuarial realities too. Take a look at the attack rate. About 10% of hospitals are effectively hit, or successfully hit, I should say, in the US each year, which means about 600 or 700 hospitals of the 7,000. When you look at that from a dollars and cents thing, someone looking at the actuarial tables will say, that gives me 10 years before I'm likely to be hit, or 5 years before I'm likely to be hit. Should I really spend all this money, or should I gamble on not being hit because they're not gonna focus on me? And that was a sobering reality, because at the end of the day, it all comes back to those dollars and cents again. And a very convincing, I'm not gonna say good, but convincing argument can be made that, hey, our money is better spent elsewhere than security if that's the right attack.
I read a thing last year about insurance, like ransomware insurance. And it said, some of the attackers will go out, try to find the list of customers who have purchased insurance,
Yep.
and they'll specifically target those companies because they know they'll get paid.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's an article out there somewhere, I can dig it up if you want. But they did a profile of one of the attacker gangs, and they are literally recruiting people. They have an HR department. The people working there don't realize they're working for an attacker gang. They've segmented their front and back of house. These are run like a business. These are, in some cases, they're a kid in his mom's basement. But in a lot of cases, they are kind of Russian or Eastern European gangs that have found a clear path to revenue. And if you're a Russian gang that gets caught, what is the US government going to do about that? Are we gonna swoop into Moscow or wherever and arrest folks? Is it worth our effort to do that? And the reality is no.
I think that's one of the biggest problems about it. I think the most frustrating thing is that there's really nothing the federal government can do about it. When we're talking about foreign actors.
When we're talking about foreign actors, there's physically nothing they can do. There's a lot they can do to help out, and I'll get to some of that stuff. And then finally, take all this complication, and at the end of the day, we have to know that healthcare environments are very, very different. Right? If you're out on an oil and gas rig and you have IoT devices that are hacked and it takes you offline, you're going to lose some money. You might have an oil spill. What happens if your hospital goes down? Or what happens if you're in surgery and the machine you're using goes down, the monitor you're using? If the Windows update thing pops up while you're being catheterized, which we've seen before. That's not what you want, right? And we all wince just a little bit there. So you have to understand that there is the real, I'll leave that a second. There's this real need to understand healthcare environments because the impacts are very much human, right? What was that question?
Mr. Masad.
Something about why do people not invest in security in the industry? I didn't see the second part of the
All right,
question.
so, what could be the reasons of not investing on hospital security? Is it money matter or not having mandatory compliance? Okay, good question. It is both, and I'll get to the compliance here in a little bit, but at the end of the day, think of it this way. 25 years ago or so, when the web was just opening up and you could just start buying stuff online, there was a ton of fraud and payment processors were getting hit hard, right? And they started to realize that if they didn't do something to stop all these attacks, the government was going to jump in. So what came out of that? You guys know? PCI DSS, right? So they all got together and said, we need to start self-regulating and figure out a way to do that. They did that successfully because they're for-profit enterprises and they could read the writing on the wall and they could calculate if we invest X in security, we get Y return. Healthcare can't really do that because that's not the mindset. Think of it this way, most healthcare environments, one, they're very comfortable with death, right? They see death all day, every day. It's sad, but true. And two, they very much think in a triage mentality, right? We tell everyone, go for a walk, eat your salad, more protein, less fat. The reality is a lot of the effort and a lot of the money spent is on caring for patients that are having an emergency in that moment. And so when everything is a triage mentality, you have to think more reactively in how you're adopting things rather than proactively. right? We're a company that can go in, we can map a whole network. We can generate the policies to actually secure your network, to segment your network, to microsegment device by device, and we can help you roll those out. But that's a big effort, right? I got winded just saying, you have 10,000 devices, that's a lot of effort and a lot of testing. Or you can put network detection and response in place and say, hey, when there's an attack coming through, we should focus on that and save our efforts elsewhere. And that's kind of the triage mentality. So I half answered the question. I'll get to the compliance stuff in just a second. And we've talked about it a little bit, but how many online devices can you see in this picture?
Probably 2 if you include the bed. Or is that a, oh,
That's the answer I was hoping for, something low. So I did this.
they're holding it.
Yeah, I did this once at a conference that have bioheads or HCMT members. These are the people that go around and actually fix all the devices. And we counted 15. Now we had a little more time than I gave you there, but they actually got up to 15. I have 10 things right now. And what I want to point out is not necessarily the medical equipment, the bed and stuff, but things like the window locks, the door locks. This is a remote for a smart TV. How many smart TVs are in hospitals?
Probably one for every.
One for every room, right? And so we have to start thinking about what's actually in a hospital, because what else is in hospitals? Have you ever seen a PlayStation or a Nintendo in a hospital? How's that PlayStation network working out for everyone? Gets me free credit monitoring, right? But it opens up vulnerabilities to everyone that's there. Do you guys trust Elon Musk and his team at Tesla? Because Tesla's good on networks, right? How about Alexas? Not Lexus, Alexas, Amazon Alexas. Those are everywhere. People bring them in because they might be there for a long time and they want to have their Alexa with them. So one, there's potential vulnerabilities. Two, there are massive HIPAA violations there because Alexa is designed to always be listening and in theory delete everything it just heard. But that's just leaking patient data left and right.
Cameras, thermostats.
Get everything. And so this is from our platform. One thing that we do is the way we work is we monitor network traffic because the vast majority, and I mean 99.999% of traffic in healthcare environments in the US, unencrypted. No encryption at all. So what we do is we actually sit and we monitor copies of network traffic, and we can see what devices you have, physically where they are, what Wi-Fi points they're hitting. This is just half of the vendors that start with A that we have in our demo environment, right? So that's what, roughly 12 by 3, so 30 something vendors. And you can see there's, and again, this is based on a real environment, 393 Apple devices, 36 Amazon devices. And as you dig in, you start to realize how many consumer devices are online. So not only do you have all those critical vulnerabilities on known medical devices, you also have everything else that's coming in on the guest network. You have people that are getting on the non-guest network and putting things that have vulnerabilities on them. It's an absolute mess. And this is the one that I teased earlier. Anyone from Aethon here? Anyone know anyone from Aethon? Anyone want to sue us into oblivion? So effectively, we were monitoring a customer's network traffic. We saw this really weird thing where a device we didn't know was making elevators go up and down and doors open and close. We thought that's really interesting because most technologies should not have that power. And as we dove into it, we realized that there are these robots that go through hospitals. That one's about the size of this podium, maybe a little bit bigger. It weighs about 500 pounds. And it replaces effectively the runners that are in hospitals, the people that go around, they deliver food, they take out trash, they change linens, things like that. These robots go through the hospital about 2 or 3 miles an hour, and they just replace people that are running around, right? There's a very real, really good use for them. But what we saw was not only were they moving things around, but they were interacting with patients, right? They were moving around them, they could give beeps, they could play some very basic things. And as we dove in trying to figure out what this device was and why it was on the network and why it was getting access to restricted areas that people didn't have, we also started to realize that there were firmware vulnerabilities in this device that were completely compromised, which is fine if this device is only in the network in a specific area. But this device also has an admin control panel that is completely web accessible, as long as you put it behind your firewall, you're okay. Do all the hospitals worldwide put that behind the firewall? Absolutely not. And the way that that admin console checked credentials is a pop-up on a web browser that said, put your credentials in. Because anyone that has ever done a cyber range event or with me or anyone else knows that's one of the easiest things to bypass. You go in, you delete the JavaScript, boom, you have full access. And that's exactly what happened here. One hospital we had 40 of these devices that if we had wanted to, we stopped short of this, we could have brought them all together and put them in any physical room in the hospital. So imagine you're in ICU and 40 of these things, 500 pounds a piece, come charging through the doors. That's not good. And that's the kind of threat we're seeing, right? If there was a real attack on one individual, that's what we would actually see. And so the reality was this was really, really hard to fix. One, because there were those firmware vulnerabilities that we actually had to go and update the firmware. That's hard. The web console was a little bit easier. You deploy that once and it updates. But because not everyone has their patch mechanisms up to date, because not everyone's really easy to get in touch with, because some companies, I'm not going to say their name, don't even have a security act, whatever company thing where you can report these issues, they're going to ignore you for a long time. And then you're going to hear back from their lawyers, and then it's going to get really, really litigious. When all you want to do is help them secure these so attackers aren't getting hurt, or patients aren't getting hurt. And so at the end of the day, not only do we have all these vulnerabilities, we're talking about devices and can we patch them, we also have manufacturers that are completely driven by profit, and they think security is an afterthought. We've all worked for half a dozen companies that think like that. And that's the challenge we're facing, is they're so focused on getting thousands of these things out the door with care of patients front of mind as it should be, that they're not thinking about how to properly secure them. And we have all kinds of literature on that online if anyone wants to read it.
Is there pending litigation regarding this? Or?
No, what ended up happening was it got really, really stressful. And then we had done a disclosure, we had done a webinar, and we'd done several reports on this. And they let us know, we ended up agreeing what we could and could not share. But it was ultimately productive, but not fun. It also goes to show that, hey, if you have security vulnerabilities, or at least have a security @ email address so people can report things, and don't assume malicious until there's clear intent of being malicious. And this, again, this all just started with saying, why is something moving elevators that's not human? Because that seems like a really weird thing to be able to do. But in this case, makes kind of perfect sense. So I talked a little bit about regulation. What we're seeing now is, in the case of PCI DSS, they self-regulated. It's been a very productive program for 20-something years. In healthcare, we're not seeing self-regulation. We're not seeing hospitals get out in front of this. Some individual ones are leading the way and doing a very good job, but it's still far below what other industries are. And we've seen all the stats why. And so what started to happen over the last 10 years or so is we're seeing increasing government involvement. And I'm not here to debate whether that's right or not, but effectively, as we see hundreds and hundreds of attacks, more and more senators and Congress people are seeing their districts get impacted. And when you get to a certain threshold of that, people are going to start looking at it. So in 2015, we had the first Cybersecurity Act that mentioned healthcare. Went about 4 more years before we got any more legislation around it, where something called HICCUP, HICP, was the first set of guidance on how to properly secure environments, healthcare environments specifically. We went another 4 years, and then 2023 was a huge burst of activity. One was we had HICCUP updated, so newer practices. We had the Patch Act, the National Cybersecurity Strategy, and the Rural Hospital Cybersecurity Enhancement Act. And I think the most telling of those 3 is they were all bipartisan efforts, some with senators that will never ever agree on anything but this one thing. So bipartisan support as more and more communities, particularly small communities, get hit. And then there's an organization called ARPA-H, which funds moonshot efforts. And typically they're like, how do we cure cancer and things like that? They've started to include cybersecurity in that. So they found their first $50 million for something called DigiHeals, which is an effort to figure out how to better secure environments. That was all last year. This year, we had the cybersecurity performance goals released, and I'll talk about those in a second. We had 1.3 billion proposed for small and rural hospitals for funding. Now, just giving that money to small and rural hospitals will do absolutely nothing. You need to give them guidance, training, people, all that stuff. But at least there's been some effort. We saw ARPA-H extend DigiHeals to upgrade, which is looking for ways to automatically identify devices and then upgrade those devices. And if you think of that, that gets really complicated. Think of the catheter example I gave you earlier. You don't want to update that device when it's physically in someone, amongst many other things, right? We had the Healthcare Cybersecurity Improvement Act of 2024, and we have one or two that have actually been announced in the last couple of months that I just haven't had time to put up there and I forget the name of. So what we're seeing is that there's more and more legislation and more pointing to regulation because there's so much attention. There are so many people that are being impacted by this. The government is starting to step in. Whether we agree with it or not, doesn't matter. That's what's happening. And the one that I try to promote the best, because I think this is the best possible way to do this, it looks very similar to OWASP top 10 list, is the the HPH Cybersecurity Performance Goals. These were released in January this year. They came from a really good spot. The government, private industry, and public industry all got together and they said, what can we do to give very clear guidance on what hospitals should be doing? It was everyone's interest to get together something, and the best thing they did is they made these very simple. They said we have two categories. One is the essential goals. These are things like multi-factor authentication, email security, better encryption. Things that we all take for granted because we've worked in security for more than a couple of years. A lot of hospitals, particularly small and rural ones, still need that kind of guidance. In the website, these are all give you a lot of guidance, and it's pretty easy to find vendors that do this. So the first thing they said was these essential goals, you need to do them today. If you're not, you should be. They also got places like Microsoft and Google on board where they're starting to offer these services. Now that looked like it was more promotion than anything else, but the good news is people are aligning with this. We can say, let's get you to the bare minimum. From there, we're starting to have enhanced goals as well. And what they did here was they said, okay, those are the essential goals. You need to get those in place today. Then what you need to start moving is towards these things that other industries have started to adopt or have adopted that we can learn from and tailor to healthcare environments. So these are things like I mentioned earlier, asset inventory, just looking at network traffic to see what devices you have, where they are, what their settings are, things like that. Basic cybersecurity testing, mitigating known vulnerabilities, better configuration management, et cetera. So what you have is what you need to do today and the roadmap of where to go forward. And what will likely happen is these lists will likely lead the way for whatever future legislation comes up around this. And there's a lot of crosstalk. I was at an event in DC where everyone was as important as they thought they were. And they were saying, hey, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. But at the end of the day, I think the consensus is they're gonna make money available. Hopefully it's a carrot, not a stick thing. If you do these things, you will get more funding. The other side of that is if you do not do these things, we will cut off Medicare and Medicaid funding, which will only hurt small and rural hospitals more and more. But we have the framework that they're going to be working off from. If nothing else, this gives clear guidance on what people should do to stop getting attacked. Questions about that?
Have you seen anything like I'm imagining, well, like what BugCrowd and HackerOne and some, those companies can do, or even a bug bounty program where they just run it in-house. You invite the practitioners of the world to help, responsibly disclose anything. Have you seen hospitals take anything up like that, or maybe solicit equally as much help fixing known issues, whether or not they've been reported?
Maybe some of the biggest. I haven't seen that, and I would be really surprised if more than a few hospitals, big hospital systems, do that. The small and rural hospitals are absolutely not going to do that, just because, again, they're not getting email security in place. Letting pen testers run wild is not going to happen there at all. What has happened is there were some regulations passed about a year and a half ago that as more medical devices come to the market, they have to go through a security audit. We actually have seen some medical devices be rejected because they haven't passed those basic audits. So in terms of bug bounty, I'd be really surprised if we see like a BugCrowd. BugCrowd's taken off. They just got a huge round of funding.
Yeah.
Dave, I worked with when he was like young. Now he's the CEO, and I feel old. But I'd be really surprised, only the most advanced environments where they know what they're doing and probably have internal pen testers where they do something like that. I think you'll see more pressure on the device manufacturers, which is only a small part of the problem.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So what can you do? Honestly, I had a really hard time with this slide because typically I'm speaking specifically to healthcare people, often either HTMs or IT folks. At the end of the day, this is about improving awareness. You know, most of us have seen an attack or two in our backyards. We don't know how big the picture is. If nothing else, I hope this is an interesting topic for everyone because it does affect us all at some point. And if you are in healthcare, I highly recommend getting involved with groups like HIMSS, like InfraGard, and the 4 or 5 other organizations that are out there. Because if nothing else, I join a cyber health working group through InfraGard every month, and we have the FBI coming on and talking in a semi-closed group about the attacks that have happened and attacker motives. And that's why I kind of gave the Russia-China example earlier, because they talk about what the motives behind nation states in certain regions are. So highly recommend getting into those groups, particularly if you're in healthcare environments. We do all this stuff. That's my pitch. The thing that we do that's really cool is we have what we call a collector. It's an appliance that physically goes in network. And just looking at network traffic tells us where attacks are happening, how they're happening, how you can stop them. So if you're in healthcare environments, looking at network traffic as a way to inform those reactive protections, the proactive ones too, but those are a bigger lift. Looking at that is incredibly powerful. So if anyone wants to learn more, I'll happily go into that.
You just put AI driven analysis up there just to say, we use AI, right? Buzzwords.
I have webinars, I have
Yeah.
white papers. And
All it.
I am pleased that my hand was forced to write that garbage.
No,
No, we use AI incredibly productively to identify attacks and help stop them.
You just better hope the AI don't hallucinate that there's some threats there that aren't really there.
So let me explain.
There aren't threats.
So
That's more important.
let me explain the coolest thing we actually have done with AI. Is we're going through and we're doing analysis, and what we have is, we have a research team that is effectively looking at all the data to see where there's vulnerabilities or potential attacks. And they're feeding the AI, and then the AI is feeding them. So we get this really cool feedback loop where we're tailoring the AI to healthcare environments to help them identify attacks. So that's been really, really productive in taking just terabytes of data and
Yeah,
trimming it down to the 3 or 4 real instances we see each month. It's also been, it will be really good at correlating attacks, right? So when you have all these alerts, you don't know what is actually correlated to one another. It's getting better at doing that. So if my bosses or CEO is listening, we love our AI. It's great. And I'm sorry I missed it on this slide.
no, I just had to bring it up.
No, everyone's an AI company, right?
Yeah, like overnight. Pretty much.
So here's my best use of AI. We had to rebrand in about 3.5 weeks last year.
Yeah.
Because the CEO had a whim.
Yeah.
I rewrote all of our collateral in 3.5 weeks using ChatGPT and actually, what's the Google one?
Bard.
No, not Google then. What's the Microsoft?
Oh, Gemini.
Gemini. Gemini is awesome for LinkedIn posts in creating 1- and 2-page data sheets, the content behind it. It does a good job replacing me, which is great. So I highly recommend it for marketing material.
Well, LinkedIn, you can, if you have LinkedIn Premium, you can just start writing with AI right there.
Yeah.
So that you hear more regurgitated, it makes me so mad.
And the quality of
We can't
stuff.
replace you.
No. AI can't stand up here. But so the actual quality of Gemini I've seen going down. It could write really good 1- and 2-page data sheets for me about 10 months ago. It will now take the bullet points I have and just regurgitate the bullet points. So it's a real job to actually go and make it useful again.
Well, it's because the models become lazy.
Well, they get so much garbage. It just, no, it does. It's just, it's sucking in everything. And I used to be able to go and say, who is scenario, what do we do? And it would give me 2 or 3 good sentences that I could edit pretty easily.
Yeah.
Now it's incredibly kind of,
Or maybe it's just trying to emit a little less CO2.
I promise you that is not the case. I promise that's not the case. That's why the big players are building nuclear power plants now, right?
Yeah.
3 Mile Island is getting fired back up.
Yeah.
Questions? Oh, biggest one, don't be terrified to go to a hospital, right? If you go back to the actual numbers here, so you have 700 to 1,000 attacks in the US each year. Those attacks typically last 1 to 4 weeks. The odds that you're in a hospital while it's getting attacked and your care is going to be compromised are incredibly low. Right? It's having a massive impact on people and on finances, but if you're playing the odds, you're going to be okay.
Is there a time of the year or, like, any scheduling aspect that you've seen that may mean attacks happen closer around certain seasons or around certain holidays?
That's a good question. I have all the numbers. I haven't actually looked at it seasonally. I do know that it picks up a little bit in the end of the year and the back half of the year, last 6 months. But that could just be reporting, who's reporting what under what timelines.
Right.
My guess is it's within 15% month to month. It's a pretty steady pace. Because again, a lot of the delays in executing the attack is finding someone to negotiate the ransom.
Yeah, where you are on the attacker's backlog of people to attack.
They're literally sitting in the environments. One thing that used to happen, it doesn't
Lying
anymore.
there and wait, they're waiting for, when's Jeremy Young going there? He's not letting me on there, sure ain't that way.
So
Then boom,
they used to run like consultants almost. Hey, we found this vulnerability. If you pay us, we will tell you all the vulnerabilities we found, kind of give a mini report, and you could go and patch those all. That went away as soon as they realized they could just get a ransom payment. So now they're in environments. It's a matter of when they want to pull the trigger.
Have you seen any indication of like cyber insurance changing to meet the needs better, or is it basically just a stone wall of you let us take over your IT if you get hacked, or we don't insure you?
Cybersecurity insurance is going to change for one thing, and that's for them to make more profit. So one thing that they are starting to do a little bit, not as much as they should, is they do have bare minimums of what you need to do to be eligible for insurance, but it's such a low bar that it's not a really big thing. And it's more a way for them to get out of the payment if you do get breached.
yeah, it's like pre-existing condition.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's exactly what it is.
yeah.
Yeah, so people will continue to buy cybersecurity insurance. It's a known best practice. In some cases, it's worked out for folks, but it's more like 15 years ago, when CISOs first became a thing, you would hire a CISO just to fire them 18 months later, right? They'd get fired, you'd say, oh, that CISO didn't do their job. And then they go down the road and get a higher paying job because everyone needs a CISO. That's what we're seeing in healthcare right now, except they're not getting fired, right? You can be breached and they're like, we don't know what we're doing. That CISO knows better than anyone. Let's keep them on. So it's more, this is what you're supposed to do.
Well, plus they're making CISOs where they're a little more responsible for what's going on, which I don't really agree with.
I think it's mostly from fraud.
Something that is being actively discussed.
So
You know,
when CISOs go to jail, that's a great way to discourage people from becoming CISOs.
well, I know, yeah,
Right.
definitely.
But I really think that has to do with like fraud and less to do with
Yeah.
incompetence.
Yeah.
I don't think you can go to jail as a CISO for making a mistake. You can go to jail for
Covering up
representing to the
mistakes.
government that you've done something that you haven't.
Yeah. What was it, SolarWinds, was that the?
Yeah,
one?
there's SolarWinds, there's Uber.
Made that entire thing.
So, I don't expect CISOs, particularly in hospitals, are gonna go to jail anytime soon unless they're trying to make an example of someone. In a lot of times, and again, there's more small and rural hospitals, so I'm kind of speaking to them. A lot of times the CISOs might have 1 or 2 people in a budget that isn't much more than the salaries of those people. What are they supposed to do with that?
I know. Great.
Other
So
questions? Yeah.
You say that like cybersecurity insurance is best practice, and so are you saying that most of them have it and then don't file claims because they don't want to deal with the repercussions?
I don't know the rates of who has it. It's more, I hear of people more calling the FBI first than they are cybersecurity insurance. Because the FBI, the FBI has changed their approach. It used to be like, okay, you've been hacked, let us know if you need any help, click. Now they will be more active in the negotiation recovery. Because there's such an overwhelming number of attacks that they realize they have to step up more.
Yeah, the FBI for a long time was saying, don't pay the. Don't pay the ransom.
They still say don't pay the ransom. So the best response, I heard a CIO somewhere in Virginia. And his response was, you should never ever pay the ransom, but always be prepared to. Because think about what they're trying to do. They're trying to provide care to their community, which includes their family, people they see every day. If the best path to restoring that care, even if it's a gamble, is to pay a couple $1 million in ransom, you can understand why people might take them up on that. Even if they know it's probably not gonna work, that's a Hail Mary that they might be willing to throw.
That's why I think the math is kind of, so it's kind of alluding to before, it's like. The guidance is not to pay the ransom, but at the same time. If it's an overseas actor in like Russia, it's not like the FBI can do anything for you. It's not like they can arrest them, so.
Right,
It's really kind of a rock on a hard place kind of thing.
that's why we're attacked. That's like, the attackers are not stupid people. They're realizing exactly what our environments look like and they're taking full advantage of that. Sorry, I wish I could get better guidance than that, but like until we're all educated and we all know, hey, here's what's happening, we can't start fixing it.
Yeah, and everybody starts programming in Rust, right?
I don't think all those COBOL systems that places are still relying on are gonna be replaced anytime soon, which might actually be a benefit here. Anything else? Anyone online? Did I miss anyone?
Had a couple of folks drop offline, but
Okay.
yeah, if there are any questions, feel free to come off mute if you'd like to, but if not, that's okay too.
Let's see a chat. Cool. Cool. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you, Chad.
Let me see.